Happy 2019, everyone! I have been spending my time since the holidays playing Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and Starlink Battle for Atlas, two good games that are also very long. So we're going to do something that a lot of viewers have been requesting, an updated top 10 worst games I've reviewed list, because I haven't made such a list since February of 2015. It is almost 4 years out of date, and I've reviewed a lot of porkers since then that deserve an extra kick in the gonads. Plus, everybody makes top 10 lists this time of year and might as well ride the search traffic. I'm going to lay out a few ground rules before we get the list started. First of all, games that appeared on the first list will not reappear here because I'd like to talk about some different games. If you want a definitive list, I do believe that Superman 64 is worse than the number 1 slot on this list, and Batman Dark Tomorrow and Aquaman Battle for Atlantis are probably worse than ranks 4 and below. Ranks 4 and below, not counting Superman superseding the top spot. Second, I am eliminating Steam indie games from consideration for this list because if I didn't, the entire list would look like this.
She is angry that I gave her an STD.
She should be happy you're with her.
Yeah, I'd like to cover more interesting trash. That being said, let's begin the list. Starting with a game that's probably going to dominate the comments. Number 10, No Man's Sky. I don't get No Man's Sky. It's an exploration and ostensibly survival game where you explore endless, unique, procedurally generated planets, able to use a spaceship to travel anywhere on a whim in an infinitely vast galaxy. And it is inconceivably boring. The game is one massive empty map that you're meant to explore, but you never find anything that was worth looking for. Every single planet is a massive empty lot with the same scant copy-pasted landmarks that do nothing. None of the worlds have any history or culture. The sum total population of the universe is a series of NPCs that barely even notice you're there, and just spout a few pre-made quotes that mean nothing. You spend the entire game tediously picking up rocks. Rocks to reload your gun, rocks to fuel your ship, rocks to charge your shields, rocks to charge other shields, and 5 specific rocks that combine to make warp fuel that barely covers any distance because all forms of navigation in this game are slow, tedious, and annoying. And you spend hours on end picking up these rocks because there's otherwise no gameplay. Most of the would-be enemies completely ignore you, it's easy to flee from spacebound enemies, and there's so little reward for combat you might as well just run from enemies to save time. They added a story mode and it's one tedious, boring fetch quest after another with a boring, nothing story. The only real goal you get is to reach the center of the galaxy, which does nothing but reset the game. Most of the side content gets you upgrades that you can't use or money that you really don't need once you've traded up on your ship. There just doesn't seem to be any meaningful goal or worthwhile reward to make the gameplay satisfying. Nothing to compel you to play past the first few hours. Damned if you bring this up to No Man's Sky's ravenous fanbase, though. Most of the comments have since been deleted by their users, but within a day of posting my review, it was swarmed by rabid No Man boys bitching about a video that 90% of them clearly didn't watch, claiming I didn't actually play the game when I played for 20 hours, claiming I was only crapping on the game for easy views when the game was dead as the dodo as far as YouTube's algorithm is concerned, insisting my review was invalid because I mentioned the game's launch date for a whole 2 minutes at the start of a half-hour video, insisting I purposefully only played the game unpatched when I extensively talked about the game's then current state and painstakingly added research notes for updated features, insisting the entire review was invalid because the mass RNG means an item I said is rare isn't always rare, one delusional bastard who claimed that No Man's Sky was never intended to be a finished product, or insisting the entire review was invalid because I didn't mention the economy system. Fine, if you bring specific items to specific places at specific times, you might be able to sell them for more quasi-useless money than usual. That totally fixes my problems with the boring, lifeless universe, complete lack of meaningful gameplay, or the fact that every second spent in the game was a continued waste of my time! Oh, and within a day of posting my review, I got my first ever notification of someone trying to hack my Twitter account, because that's rational. When I quit No Man's Sky, I merely disliked it. Now I actively hate its Weasley black guts out because being a toxic fan online just turns more people against you, although some viewers just respectfully disagreed with my opinion. You guys are cool. A few months after my review dropped, No Man's Sky got a massive update called Next. They added true multiplayer, 2 years too late, mostly reset everyone's inventories, made the crafting slightly more complicated, and now players can share those seemingly worthless bases and freighters. But none of the updates that I read about address my primary complaint. What is the point of playing No Man's Sky? I could see it being that time sink game that you casually turn on when you're not doing anything else, poor man's Minecraft and now a dash of poor man's EVE Online, but that's not what No Man's Sky was meant to be. It's what the game morphed into after its initial concept crashed and burned. I was going to check out Next for an update review, but the more I look back at how I sunk 20 hours into getting absolutely nowhere, I cannot stand the thought of ever touching this game again. I will concede the game has a niche audience. And if you're outside that niche, then you're as welcome as Matthew Broderick in a Godzilla movie. Number 9. How to Train Your Dragon 2. How to Train Your Dragon 2, the video game, doesn't have a plot, despite both movies being incredibly strong in the story department. The main characters from the films are competing in 4 tournaments for fun, and that's it. Each tournament consists of 9 copy-pasted events, and 7 of those events are Superman 64 style flying through rings. Flying through rings while rushed on a time limit or while racing against computer players. How did anybody think an entire game of flying through rings was still a good idea? It's stressful, it's tedious, it's not at all fun, and even with this abysmal starting point, the game somehow gets worse from there. The 5 playable characters are so wildly imbalanced that Toothless, who I remind you is the main character of the series, is so drastically slower than 3 of the other dragons that he has no chance of winning any of the races. The controls are terrible. Flying straight up or down completely changes the controls so you fly wildly off course on accident, and several courses are designed with dives, sharp turns, or vertical climbs to make sure that you crash into the control issues repeatedly. But the thing that pushes How to Train Your Dragon 2 over the edge is that the AI opponents cheat, and they cheat a lot. The AI has access to a special attack that just automatically knocks you off your dragon whether they have a weapon equipped or not. Every item and attack loses you so much time that it's the Mario Kart blue shell on steroids, and you're powerless to avoid them. And the cherry on top, during the 4th and final tournament, the game just so happened to glitch so that I couldn't use any of my items for the rest of the race. And this glitch happened twice in one tournament. The only way to beat the last 2 sets of races is to hope against hope that you can take an early and big enough lead that the enemies can't land any hits on you, and then maintain that lead for the entire race. Because once the AI catches you, game over. They'll cheap shot you to death and you can't do shit about it. This game is pure misery. The only redeeming quality to the game is that they seem to have done a pretty good job recreating the island of Berg from the movies, and fans may get a kick out of flying around the island, and isn't that a damning endorsement? The game is decent if you're not playing it. Number 8. Catwoman. I opted to review Catwoman because none of the reviews that I could find adequately explained why the game was so terrible, and as I sit here to write a summary about the game, I'm struggling with it myself. Catwoman is best described as Prince of Persia as made by a meth addict. It's a platformer with platforming more terribly designed and programmed than you can imagine. Almost every jump, the fixed camera is skewed at an awkward angle so that you can't gauge the jump, and the jumping itself is programmed with abysmal detection so that you constantly slide right off jumps that you should have nailed. I've caught the game red-handed, refusing to register that I've made a jump unless I perform the jump one ludicrously specific way, like some jumps are just explicitly hard-coded not to work. And every time you fall, you have to backtrack through a huge chunk of the level to get another crack at the jump. The game's built to be finished in 3 hours. It took me 6. It goes without saying that the story sucks. I mean, look at the movie that they had for source material. But then the combat is also basted in what were they thinking juice. Catwoman can't actually defeat any of the enemies on her own. Your attacks knock enemies down, but you can't actually kill enemies. Enemies only die if you knock them into a stage hazard, or if you land enough hits on an enemy that they run into a stage hazard on their own to kill themselves. Apart from the combat being slow, tedious, and controlling like crap, it's, quite frankly, bizarrely sexist. Who the hell programs a superhero game where said superhero is too weak to take out any bad guys on their own? Oh, and most of the upgrades are either useless, like they were made for a completely different game, or they're glitched and they don't work at all. All in all, I think the Catwoman game actually improves on the movie, because the movie can't help but look better in comparison. Now let's bash Quino's skull against the roof some more as punishment for that fashion sense. Number 7. Minute to Win It. The Wii has a very negative reputation among so-called mainstream gamers. It's widely regarded as a baby toy with gimmicky motion controls that barely work. It's a reputation that I think is really unwarranted. Wii games go by a case-by-case basis. I've played plenty of Wii games where the motion controls work great or do really fun things with the mechanics. I've played Wii games where the motion controls were shoehorned in and completely unnecessary, but I've only played one Wii game so far that's truly broken from top to bottom, and that game is Minute to Win It. If you're unaware, Minute to Win It was a game show where contestants would try to complete 10 minigames using household items, each with a 1-minute time limit. Given the real-life games are explicitly designed to be played in your living room with crap that you have lying around, you'd think the video game would be unnecessary. But here we are with a collection of 36 wholly unplayable motion control minigames. Each game has 3 problems. For one, the directions you're given are so infuriatingly vague or even incorrect that you'll have no idea what you're supposed to do. For 2, the games require such ludicrously specific input to work that it takes several mulligan rounds to figure out what the game wants. And 3, it's still a crapshoot whether you can clear a game that you know how to play because the motion detection is abysmal. One of the games has you pulling tissues out of a tissue box, except you're meant to guess that the game won't register the motion unless the game's cursor travels straight upward, and even then, it often doesn't work.
Look how hard this is!
I gave up on a game where you have to bounce a marble by shaking the remote at really specific times with no clear cue on when those times are. And you need to get 3 or 4 perfect bounces in a row, and you need to do it 4 or 6 times, and you need to do it in 1 minute. I couldn't beat the first episode out of 4, and judging by the GameFAQs page, I still got further than most people. Couple that with ugly as sin graphics and the game being such a slapdash rush job that Guy Fieri's game over quotes don't even play when you lose, and you have an absolute garbage fire that you should only pick up if you're spiking the disc into a garbage can. Number 6. Rambo, the video game. The arcade rail shooter is one of the oldest and most time-tested video game genres on the market, so you'd think it'd be pretty much impossible to screw them up this late in the game. Yet here we are with Rambo. It's hard to even know where to start, but let's begin with the fact that it's a cover-based shooter that's so unbalanced and broken that it actively kills you for using cover. Be it stages that abruptly leave you without cover, enemies with grenades or turrets who insta-kill you regardless of cover, destructible cover that disintegrates in seconds leaving you vulnerable unless you aim-bot the enemies in seconds, or long reload animations that kill you if a screen without cover comes up at the wrong time, it feels like actually using the game's cover system often gets you killed. The biggest problem with the game is just that it's unbalanced, with frustrating and broken gameplay that swamps you with enemies and little to no way to survive the enemy hordes, all before we get to the glitches. Like the time I somehow spawned outside the game's pre-built path, which shouldn't be physically possible in a game like this. Frequent crashes, half the Wrath upgrades don't work, the weapon upgrades are useless, the weapons are completely interchangeable, it abridges the movie so badly that the story is non-existent, and the notoriously abysmal production values. Character models barely resemble the original actors, soldier models are heavily recycled, there's one infamous "he's a man, not a god" voice clip that the commanders shout ad nauseum, and the crown jewel, almost all of the audio is ripped straight out of the movies, and not even the best cuts of the movies.
How's a wound? How's a wound? You told us to ignore pain, didn't you? You told us to ignore pain, didn't you? Fuck 'em. Fuck 'em.
I'm told they ripped the audio because they asked Sylvester Stallone to voice the game and he refused. Newsflash! Movie licensed games often can't get the original actors to lend their voices, but nobody's ever been stupid enough to rip audio from 30-year-old movies as Plan B! Seriously, any voice actor worth a shit has a Stallone impression locked and ready to go at all times. The game is also short as piss, clocking in around 2 hours even with the crappy free DLC, and they ignored a whole 4th movie that they could have adapted to fill time. The only way I was able to play, much less beat the game, was by stacking all my upgrades into health, equipping perks that healed me every time I landed a headshot, and just completely ignoring cover and going for constant headshots in gameplay, constantly tanking fire and just counting on regenerating more health than I was losing. So yes, you can play Rambo if you extensively work around the game's abundance of breakages. Rambo the video game has no reason to exist. It's insultingly lazy, completely broken, and it was only made to cash in on nostalgia. You can play the game, but there's no reason on earth why you should. Number 5, Drake of the 99 Dragons. Oh hey, my newest review made the list. Good thing I waited, huh? Drake of the 99 Dragons was released on the Xbox and PC. The Xbox version is unplayable because the lock-on system and camera are impossible to control, and the PC version is unplayable because the shit hit detection, animation errors, and choppy frame rate make it near impossible to land hits on enemies. Couple these problems with enemies that kill you in a few hits everywhere you go, and you have a truly miserable experience that had me primed to rage quit before the first level was done. It's hard to find a game where the basic gameplay is this broken. You can barely fight any of the enemies. You have to suicide charge every enemy or abuse the hell out of the glitchy-ass slow-mo mechanic to make any progress in the PC version. Almost every unique mechanic the game has is broken. The platforming controls are garbage with floaty jumps and horrid detection. You can run on walls, only you can barely run on walls. The slow motion glitches all the time. The detonatability is useless. You can draw nearby souls towards you, but the game doesn't explain how. The basic gameplay is nigh unbearable. All that's before we get to the cliche storm that the game calls a story. Drake is a chosen one with vague superpowers, a dead mentor, and a black trench coat who has to steal an artifact that does things from a rival clan that's trying to take over the world. And that really is as specific as I can get about the plot. The game was intended to launch a cartoon and comic book franchise, yet it gives you zero background information about the characters, setting, or plot points, as if they expected the cartoon to be such a huge success that we'd already know all this shit before the cartoon came out. We're stuck with a stupid, unlikable lug of a protagonist. The game puts you in timeout so statues can make fun of your useless ass for a full 10 seconds every time you die. Every single level is filled with cheap death traps no matter how good you are at the game. It's like every decision behind the game was explicitly intended to piss you off. The sad thing is, Drake of the 99 Dragons had a lot of good ideas at its core. Unique mechanics, a great art style, a good variety of enemies, a presumably cool sci-fi setting. But none of these ideas are balanced to where any of it works. Nobody cares what we could have gotten, because we got a heap of shit. Number 4, Space Camp. Setting aside my emotional state when I reviewed this game, I had just gone through an excruciating breakup with months of build-up leading into it, there really is no excuse for anybody to make a game this completely devoid of content and gameplay, even by the low standards of Wii shovelware. Space Camp is a game about a stupid kid who goes to a space camp where he plays 7 shitty minigames, accidentally launches a space shuttle, gets stranded at a partially constructed moon base, and has to get home by running around for 4 hours picking up rocks. Yeah, almost every quest in the game goes like this. Your character needs to access a room inside the base. You slowly wander to the room to find that it's locked. To open the room, you wander around the base slowly looking for rocks to pick up. Then you trudge clear across the map to the science room where you play a shitty slider minigame to transform the rocks into metal. Then you slowly hike to the construction room clear across the other side of the map where you play a shitty tracing minigame to turn that metal into a key. And then you use that key to open the door. Your reward for this quest is an upgrade that does absolutely nothing but open the next room. Right after you trudge around picking up more rocks, refine them into metal, and build the key that you need again. This has got to be the single most boring gameplay loop that has ever existed in any video game ever. You literally do nothing except pick up rocks! And the navigation is so ungodly slow and tedious, as all navigation is done with a pointer. The environment's so monotonous and dull, and the story's so non-existent you have no idea why you need to go to all these quests that every second of the game is spent in boredom beyond anything that you can imagine. There were a lot of shitty shovelware collections of minigames on the Wii and Wii U, but most could be asked to have some actual gameplay. Family Party 30 Great Games Obstacle Arcade was just you playing the 30 minigames, plus another 5. Ditto for Minute to Win It. As unplayable as that garbage fire was, Space Camp could only be bothered to shit out 7 minigames before they gave up and had you pick up rocks for 4 hours. That is apathy and laziness beyond mortal words. This is one of the worst games ever made, and the fact I've played games I consider far worse means something's gone horribly wrong with my life. Number 3. Hunt Down the Freeman. Bending the rules with this one because Hunt Down the Freeman is an indie-developed game on Steam, but A, Valve did give the developers a license agreement, so a AAA studio was involved with this game at some point, and B, it's my list. I'll do as I please. Hunt Down the Freeman is a fan game based on the Half-Life series, and all of its levels, guns, enemies, and mechanics were individually programmed by something like 50 different Half-Life fan developers who had no communication with one another. As a result, the game is broken like you wouldn't believe. Most of the game's levels are physically impossible to complete because most of the pre-scripted events don't work, and the detection for platforming is abysmal and often renders basic obstacles impassable. The game goes hours without any health packs because I'm pretty sure one of the devs thought the game had regenerating health. Combat through the entire first half of the game is broken because retro shooter enemies from Half-Life are recycled in a game that apes Call of Duty. Enemies are fast, deadly, and take a shitload of fire to kill, while you can barely move, are armed with water guns, and die in a few hits. Most of the levels are massive and so poorly signposted that you wander around for hours trying to figure out where to go and what you're supposed to do, not helped by the fact that what you're supposed to do usually glitches so that it's impossible. Even individual levels are abysmally designed. You're expected to sit in place fighting endless enemies when walking to a random spot ends the stage early, multiple stages don't use 90% of the space in the level, and the infamous hour-long snow map where you wander aimlessly getting butchered by snipers that you can barely avoid. You spend most of your time playing Hunt Down the Freeman, desperately trying to guess what the game wants from you. The only reason anybody's finished this game is because the game is a mod of Half-Life 2, which means that it incidentally has cheat codes to literally fly to the level exit. And the longer you play, the more difficult it becomes not to just phase to the exit of every damn level. The cherry on top of the game that's unplayable on multiple levels is the god-awful betrayal of a storyline. The first half of the story makes no sense to anybody who hasn't played Half-Life. The second half makes no sense to anybody, period. And the entire story is written like really bad fan fiction. Our protagonist is the brother of a fan-favorite character from the main games, a Black Ops Marine turned Venom Snake-styled mercenary commander who raises a private army to fight the Combine until a major central character from the main games personally recruits him to set in motion the entire plot of Half-Life 2. And my god, when you say it all at once, it really sinks in how obnoxious this storyline truly is. The game is so desperate to make Mitchell a godlike Mary Sue that the plot doesn't even make internal sense as a standalone story. It tries to make Mitchell a virtuous hero and nefarious villain simultaneously, and our protagonist just comes off as a complete imbecile. The only positive things that came out of the game are the memes that it spawned.
You fucked up my face.
And the purely hilarious Half-Life side story Gaiden videos making fun of the plot. But if you actually played Hunt Down the Freeman, then you were treated to one of the worst first-person shooters ever made. Number 2. Carmageddon 64. Titus is most well known for the monumental disaster that is Superman 64, but within a year they shat a second all-time worst game into existence. It boggles the mind how horrible Carmageddon 64 is. The controls are as bad as Superman 64. Turning is insanely oversensitive, and you're constantly being sabotaged by a camera that doesn't follow you close enough to tell where you're going. Every level is a humongous sandbox where the actual course is one strict, poorly signposted path that's ridiculously easy to lose track of. You take one slight, unmarked wrong turn, and congratulations, you're lost for the rest of the race. Of course I say race. The AI is actually rigged so that none of the AIs can win a race because otherwise this shit would be completely unplayable. If an enemy is in view, they suicide charge you and crash into walls. If the AI isn't in view, they just magically run the course perfectly and much faster than you. Almost like they could barely program a racing game but felt like like making one anyway. Cars behave like they have almost no mass, so grazing any slanted surface sends you flying or climbing walls like Spider-Man. Courses are horrifically designed, forcing you to perfectly walk tightropes, repeatedly make difficult jumps perfectly, or drive off-road so that you sputter constantly on the uneven terrain and the controls get even worse. There are 3 objectives you can pick between to win a race, but you can't kill all the zombies because there are literally hundreds of them. You can't kill the other racers because you have no means of attacking beyond ramming them for piddly damage, so why there are 3 objectives when 2 are impossible is beyond me. The biggest pisser that defies all common sense is the length of the races. The first set of courses you have to complete 3 laps to win a race, and each set of races adds an extra lap that you have to complete on top of that. By the time I gave up, around the game's halfway point, every individual race is 8 laps long and takes well over 20 minutes to finish a piece. And you're not given nearly enough time to finish the race unless you extensively seek out ways to extend your timer, pretty much guaranteeing that you'll need to try every race more than once to figure out how the hell the course works and how you're supposed to make up time. Without hyperbole, this game is pure torture. Every second spent playing it, you're struggling against horrible controls, hopelessly confused by the course's layout, and deeply stressed at the knowledge that any one of several problems are waiting to force you to start over, and there's nothing you can do about it. How does anybody with half a brain make a racing game where every single fundamental aspect is this inconceivably broken unless they're actively waging war on the very concept of fun? That's the magic of Titus Software. They don't go half-assed. When they fuck up everything! Before we get to number 1, a few dishonorable mentions. Games that you may have expected to see on this list, but have played so much irredeemable bullshit that they were just edged out. The Quiet Man. A lot of people were looking forward to The Quiet Man making the list due to all the hype behind it this year. It's 2.5 hours with maybe 40 minutes of gameplay. The Quiet Man's gimmick is that all the sound is muted because the protagonist is deaf. And then every single cutscene is just 2 people having a conversation that you can't hear, with no alternative means of getting information out of the scene. The game goes out of its way to be confusing by withholding a shitload of critical background information, filling the game with flashbacks that have no context, casting one actress as 2 major characters, and pulling plot twists out of its ass. A second playthrough adds the sound so you can understand the plot, and reveals the plot is so dumb that it wasn't worth understanding in the first place. The killer is the developer apparently made the game incomprehensible on purpose. He said in an interview that he wanted to portray the hardships of deaf people because he met a deaf person in a hospital once. Actual deaf gamers have written articles explaining that deaf people struggle with major prejudice every day. It's a widespread stereotype that deaf people are helpless and functionally useless because people falsely assume that they don't understand anything that happens around them. So The Quiet Man going out of its way to be incomprehensible until you turn on the sound so that people with hearing can explain the plot is not only wildly insulting to deaf people, it actively perpetuates several harmful stereotypes. Oh, and The Quiet Man also goes out of its way to only use sign language when it looks like gang signs, and it perpetuates the myth that perfect lip reading is a thing that exists. 2 more harmful misconceptions that deaf people struggle with. This is what happens when a game about deaf people doesn't have a single deaf person involved with production. Couple that with remedial symbolism that's bashed over your head every few seconds while the game shouts how brilliant it is, and you're left with an insufferably pretentious game that isn't a tenth as smart as it loudly proclaims itself to be. All of which may have been tolerable if the actual gameplay weren't the most bland, useless beat-em-up ever. It's edged off the list because it's been too long since I made one of these lists, and I have accumulated far more impressive bullshit to talk about. Another honorable mention, lest you think that was the only one, The Order 1886. Another game that wants to be a movie, except the movie is shit. The plot makes no sense, the characters are fully unlikable, and it abruptly cuts off with no resolution to any of its plot threads, because this is totally gonna be a huge franchise, you guys! Big Rigs. Big Rigs isn't so much unfinished as it is unstarted, but most people play it for free these days, and let's be honest, this shit is kind of hilarious. Jew on the Grudge. I really wanted to put this game on the list. The levels have no enemies. The game has no story or characters. The game cuts off with no hint that there's a hidden final level. The controls are ungodly tedious. There are quick time events that kill you in a single second. There's barely even a game here. It's only edged off the list because I would consider popping it in on Halloween for some creepy atmosphere. And out of necessity, my criteria for the list became games I never want to touch again for as long as I live. EA Star Wars Battlefront 2. Kind of hard to stay mad at a game that may single-handedly lead to a ban on loot boxes and which may be responsible for the major crash AAA publishers have gone through this year. Good job, EA! But yeah, that really sucks for Blizzard. Life of Black Tiger. Useless, tedious combat, barely any plot, horrible English translations, unbelievably cheap production values. How this amateur hour bullshit got onto the PS4 and is still advertised on Sony's YouTube page is truly a mystery for the ages. Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric. This is easily the second most boring game that I've ever played, a game that cares so little about the player's input that you can win fights without touching the controller. This is the complete antithesis of what Sonic should be. Slow, boring, tedious, and the characters have the personality of cardboard whose mouth you want to staple shut. There's barely any gameplay or storyline here, and what little does exist is terrible. At the very least, the game is so bland, homogeneous, and generic that it isn't offensive. A feat that cannot be said for our number 1 entry. Number 1. Ride to Hell, Retribution. I mean, what else could it be at this point? Ride to Hell Retribution is broken across the board. All 3 of its gameplay modes are miserable. The driving levels are broken. They have a terrible camera. You have to micromanage while driving or you can't see where you're going. The physics kill you for grazing any object, whether it should affect you or not. So many of the enemies are impossible to kill that they're rigged to kill themselves, and the controls are floaty. The combat is broken. It's a bad ripoff of Arkham Asylum's combat, except the counter system barely works, so you stun lock every single enemy with the guard break kick because trying to play legitimately gets you killed, and somehow picking up a weapon doesn't actually do anything. The shooting is broken. Every damn enemy is a bullet sponge that takes a shitload of bullets to kill. To avoid running out of ammo or being overrun, you have to tediously line up headshots on every single enemy with controls that are way too sloppy to line up those headshots, not to mention half the weapons are useless because they scatter bullets everywhere and it takes a full magazine to kill a single enemy. The AI is broken, at times taking cover behind empty air. The bosses are broken, revolving around mechanics that aren't explained or fighting you in bullshit arenas. The level design is broken. Almost every turret is impossible to use, and the game's conceit to a difficulty curve is to swamp you with enemies and have them swarm already flanking you and cheap shot you to death while you struggle to get any kills. The cover system is broken. Most of the objects you can take cover behind don't block bullets, and it's a crapshoot what you'll use as cover when you push the button and whether it'll work. I had to bump the difficulty down in one stage because this cover-based shooter has sections with no cover. The sound is broken. The music cuts out and multiple cutscenes take place in silence, as I swear over half the game's sound effects are just flat out missing. The graphics are broken. Characters have no facial animations and look so ugly I think someone tried to drown the entire game in sewer water. Even the store page was broken. I've read the game was pulled from Steam because they tried to give it a 160% discount and trying to charge negative money broke the store. The game is insanely glitchy. Aiming will become impossible because the iron sight button stopped working. You'll fail mandatory QuickTime events because the button you're instructed to push stopped responding. The game has a ton of cutscenes with voice actors that couldn't act wet in a tsunami and character models that can't emote at all. The last level has enemies that one-shot kill you because you don't get to leave hell yet. The only thing worse than the unbearably tedious, simultaneously boring and infuriating gameplay is that this repetitive-ass, sometimes nigh unplayable game is for some reason 10 to 12 hours long. And the storyline, my God, the storyline. You play as Jake Conway, a Vietnam veteran whose brother is killed by a biker gang, so Jake hunts down the gang member to take his revenge. Along the way, he murders a ton of innocent civilians, pretty much wipes out the entire police force for doing their jobs, collapses several businesses for being in his way, goes on a shitload of pointless errands and sidetracks because the game is padded to Kingdom Come, and has hilariously awkward, fully clothed sex no fewer than 6 times, which brings us to the game's rampaging misogyny. Women are literal trophies trophies who you save from getting raped, and then they immediately throw down and screw on top of the corpses that you just left behind. The game has a fairly high number of female characters and extras, and every single one is either a prostitute, a stripper, or needs to be saved from male assailants. The lone exception to this rule is Brandy, and there's a valid argument to be made that she's the dumbest member of the gang you're hunting. There are no likable characters, there are no fun levels, there are no interesting plot developments or compelling stakes. There's nothing! This game has nothing! Nothing but pain and bullshit! So that was my updated list of the worst games that I've reviewed. Disagree with an entry? Feel something else should have made the list? Have another full-form essay to write about No Man's Sky? Let us merrily discuss it in the comments. People have been requesting more positive reviews, and I'm going to attempt to oblige, but don't worry, because I've got plenty more games lined up for the next time we have to make one of these lists.